Jeff Nankivell, it's good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to talk to you.
Can you share a time when you changed a long-held belief and what influenced that change?
So I have worked in my career. I was 33 years as a working in Canada's foreign service. Much of that I was working on Canadian aid programs abroad with our aid ministry, which at the time was called Canadian International Development Agency. And I was working, in the public service of Canada. About half of that 33 years I was on postings in Beijing and in Hong Kong, and about half of it I was in Ottawa at ministry headquarters. And for a good part of that career, I was in senior positions. In the kind of the second half of that 33 years, I was in executive positions. And in Canada, as in the United Kingdom, our system of government is very similar to the UK in a number of respects. One of them is we have a nonpartisan public service right up to the level of what in the UK would be the permanent secretary. In Canada, we call it the deputy minister. These people are all career public servants, and there's a very strong tradition. It's promotions are based on merit, and the public servants have an obligation to be non-partisan, not to be cheering for one political party or another, and to offer impartial advice to whichever government is in power, based on how the citizens have voted in their elections and based on the standing of parties in Parliament. And when you work in the public service side of these things, you sometimes, especially as you get in more senior positions, you come into contact with the political staff. So in Canada, as in the UK, I mentioned, up to the level of the permanent secretary, everyone in a government department is a career public servant. And then you have a minister and you have ministers' staff. There are some career public servants who are part of the minister's office staff to provide the department's input to the minister, but you also have political staff who are picked, by the political parties, by the ministers, and their jobs are not permanent. They come and go depending on who wins the elections. And the first half of my career in the public servant, I absorbed the idea that basically, the department always had the best advice, and that sometimes the political staff, some of whom have just arrived in the capital maybe. Some of them are quite young, but in positions where they have a lot of influence. And they would make requests for things that the public servants, the career public servants would say, well, that's impossible. You can't. They would say, well, the minister wants this and she wants this. And the public service people would say, well, you can't have this and this. You have to choose one. And the minister's staff often, because in politics you try to do as much as you can, would say, no, we want both. And there's a kind of a strongly held belief in some parts of the public service that, our job is really to explain to them why you can't have both and do the sensible thing and make a choice. And what I learned to appreciate was how important it is for our political systems to have both types of players, where you have the political staff who are always asking for the impossible, and you have the career public service staff who are always explaining why this can't be done, that can't be done, this other thing can't be done, and you have to choose. And if you didn't have the tension between the two, you would be missing something. And what changed, what influenced the change for me was seeing a few examples of where ideas that came from the minister's staff that initially seemed like impossible things for the ministry to do, and the senior bureaucrats, the senior officials were saying, well, no, we can't do that. And the minister's staff insisted, and a way was found to make those things happen. And it wouldn't have happened if you just relied on the public servants. But there's also a lot of things, if you only relied on the political staff, you might do a lot of things that are ill-advised and that could get the minister or get the government into trouble, or would be bad public policy. So I learned that both parts, both sets of players have an important part to play, and it's the combination together. It creates tension, but it's a useful tension in our in our system. Just like in a company, you need to have some people who are visionaries who think, let's do this thing that's never been done before. And you need to have some people who can explain, well, here's why that might be dangerous or risky, or we'll lose our shirts. And you need to then have a discussion and find a balance. So I later in my career, when I had, say, new graduates coming into government as junior officers, part of the talk I would give them, I would say, don't dismiss the perspective of the political staff in the minister's office, because sometimes they have ideas that haven't occurred to us in the public service, and sometimes they push us in ways that are healthy for us. We don't necessarily like it, and it's not comfortable, but it actually generates better outcomes for the people of our country in terms of public policy and government actions. And so my perspective really changed on that about midway through my career.
Are there any beliefs you feel you'll never abandon, and why?
Well, probably a lot of the people you ask this question would say there are many, many beliefs that I have that I think I would never abandon. In my line of work as a diplomat, and now I had a think tank called the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. That's a national not-for-profit public institution to promote cooperation between Canada and Asia. So I spend a lot of time dealing with discussions about politics and economics, and I have visited most of the countries in Asia over the course of my career. And so an example of a long-held belief that I have is, I would say, is a belief in the importance of human rights for all people in a country, citizens, non-citizens, whatever group they're in, and a certain kind of basic democratic governance. It doesn't have to be necessarily the exact system we have in the UK or Canada or the United States, but you have to have accountability and transparency, and that public officials have to, you can't have, you can't protect basic human rights of everyone in society if you have a government that is not accountable to the people in the society. And so where you have an authoritarian system, like a one-party state where the police can come in the middle of the night and knock on the door and take you away and hold you without bringing a charge promptly, and can try you in secret, and your family doesn't know where you are, and you don't have access to a lawyer. I think there are certain basic human rights that are universal. There's a lot of people out there, including people in the UK, the US, Canada, Western Europe, who say those things are not really universal. There are some societies where that doesn't make sense. And I don't accept that, and I can't see myself ever accepting that. It's tempting to think, it's fine as long as people are fed. Different cultures have different systems, but I don't accept that, and I don't know in what situation I ever would.
What does it mean to disagree well?
I think the bedrock of disagreeing well is to start from the assumption that the other person has good motivation. So this can be, just where people are disagreeing within an office about something small, but it can also apply to the big political arguments of the day between, people of one political view and people of another. That to disagree well means to be generous to the person with whom you disagree, and to start by saying, look, I think, say if it's a political disagreement, and let's say someone says, the government should own major industries, and I say, no, I don't agree with that. That would be bad for society and for economic growth. Then when you get into an argument about it, it's important in that situation for me to say, look, I think we both want to have prosperity for our country. We both want the best for the people in this country. We disagree about how to get there. And here's why. But you need to focus on the argument and not the person who's making the argument. And disagreeing well means, even if it's like a very stupid idea, you think, first of all, don't call it stupid, but even you could have a strong opinion about it. You could say that idea will never work, but focus on the idea and not the person who's putting the idea forward. Don't say you're stupid and that's a bad idea. Just say, here's why I think that idea wouldn't work, but I start from my starting point is that we both want good things to happen. We just have a different understanding of how to get there.
Has there been a particular moment in your career that just really stood out where tension and disagreement was especially relevant, and or do you find most effective for managing it?
So a very common thing that comes up, and I have a number of specific examples, but that comes up in large organizations is where people in one part of the organization, or let's say people in one office. So I was a diplomat for Canada. I was Consul General of Canada in Hong Kong. So I was the chief diplomatic representative of Canada in Hong Kong and Macau for 5 years. And we had a large office, actually in two locations, and about 150 staff. And there were times when you're managing an office like that, that's far away from the headquarters city. Our headquarters was in Ottawa, the national capital, where you can get a bad dynamic where you get these instructions from headquarters, and the people in the field office, in our case the consulate general, would say, well, these are stupid things that are coming from headquarters and these guys don't understand anything, and look, here's just another example of a stupid thing. And you could see a bad dynamic starts to develop where the people in one team, let's call it my team, are assuming bad faith on the part of the people on the other team. They say they don't care about us. They just want, they haven't given any thought to what our needs are. They just have their own objectives, and and they're bad people for doing that. And this kind of dynamic happens between offices or teams in an organization, and it's easy to get into a kind of a cycle where the next message that comes in, you're already ready to criticize it and say, look, here's another stupid thing to add to the list of stupid things that we're getting from those people over there. And it goes both ways. Then I'm sure the people in headquarters would say, like, these people in Hong Kong, they don't understand the context that we're operating in. We're trying to implement a global policy, and they think they're special, and they don't understand the context. They're not very smart, or they're not good team players, and you can get that negative dynamic building up. And the way that I have found to combat that is to really work with your team to develop a mindset, as I was saying in my earlier, answer to your earlier questions, that things just will work out much better if you start each time there's a new thing, each new message that comes in. And I would tell my team, I would say, look, the next message that comes in from headquarters, before you jump to a conclusion that it's going to be bad news or that it's bad policy, take a minute just to think. Let's say if I assume that this person who sent the message is well motivated and wants what's best, and if I don't understand, why they're asking for what they're asking for, I need to take a minute to think, first of all, to myself, well, why might they ask that? And not just say, look, this is a stupid request because all their requests are stupid. And ask yourself, try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and say, well, why might they ask that? And if you really don't understand, send a neutral kind of question back saying, can you explain? I'm not quite clear on why this is being requested. You might even say, because it's diplomatic, like, I'm sure, and in a non-sarcastic way, to say, I'm sure there's a good reason for this. Can you help me to understand what it is? And that, because humans, I think our brains are programmed, from millions of years of evolution, to try to think in terms of patterns. And we're also programmed to develop very quick reflexes about who we trust and who we don't trust. This is common to social animals across different species. And that combines to make a recipe for this kind of bad dynamic where you say, I've decided I don't trust that person, so whatever they send me, I'm going to be very dismissive of it or skeptical, and then our problem will grow. So what you need to do is lean against those instincts that are in us and say, each new message that comes in, or each new piece of data I get about that other office or that other person, I'm going to look at it objectively and say, maybe this is another thing in a pattern of negative things, but maybe it's not. And that's a way that you can kind of put brakes on so that you don't accelerate the tendency to think the person you've decided you don't trust, that everything you get from them is going to be, a bad thing for you. And that, if you don't take that kind of point of view, then of course it's going to be impossible ever to come to a different conclusion about someone. And, people should be more open-minded than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And while the political field is very different from the educational field, do you have any thoughts or ideas on how schools and universities could promote good disagreement?
Well, I did, and it may not come as a surprise for someone who's had a career as a diplomat and a public figure. I did a lot of debating in school and in university. And I think it really is an excellent training ground in at least two respects. One is, I think everyone should do it, because no matter where you are, learning and practicing marshaling your arguments. So whether you're going to go and work in a company, or you're going to be an entrepreneur, or you're going to be working in an organization, or you're going to be a teacher, or a nurse or a doctor, you need to be able to influence people. At some point in your career, there's going to be things that you want that's going to require you to get someone to agree with you. And debating's good training for that. But in terms of promoting good disagreement, debating's particularly important because it gives you, the opportunity to try out, to see what it feels like to argue for a side that you don't agree with. And that's very powerful. And in the same way, I was just saying, in this situation I described of two offices in conflict, that you should try to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and say, like, what's the best reason that a well-motivated person could have for making this request? What you learn through debating, and it's not just doing like one debate, but doing a whole series of them, is you will get assigned to argue something that you really don't believe in. And it's a good exercise, because we don't do this enough in our daily lives, just to think, okay, I don't agree with these people on that issue, but to actually take the time to think, if I had to argue their case, what would be the best arguments that I could think of? And in each case that I can think of, where like sometimes in a very competitive situation, my debating partner and I were national champions in Canada. We participated in world championships for debating, English language university debating championships. Each time we had to argue the side of a resolution with which we fundamentally disagreed. It could be, take my example about basic human rights. Let's say if I had to argue, so I meant, I told you earlier, I don't think I would ever change my long-held belief that there is such a thing as universal human rights that need to be respected and protected, and you need to have political systems that provide accountability that protects human rights. But, I've had to do debates where I've had to argue in favor of authoritarianism, to say there is no such thing as universal human rights. Every culture has its own standards, and it's a Western construct, let's say, to believe that there's such a thing as universal human rights. And while it didn't change my mind to argue the other side of that, it did help me to reach a new level of understanding of why some people might take that view, and many people in the world do take that view. And I think that's a really useful exercise, because it teaches us empathy. It teaches us to see things from another person. It forces us to see things from another person's point of view. And I think that makes us better citizens. If we can approach, then later in life, if we can approach arguments that do come up in a spirit of saying, well, there are two sides to this. I may not, have anything in common with the person who argues the other side of it, but I'll take a minute to think about, if I had to debate this and take their side of it, what are the best arguments that I could think of? And by the way, in the corporate and organizational world, that's also absolutely critical in making good decisions. If you're the head of a company and you're trying to decide, let's say, a major financial decision, do we buy this technology, let's say, and it's $1 billion, purchase, and you think, yeah, I really want to do this. I really want to buy this company, and we're going to be a much bigger company, and it's going to be great. You absolutely need to have an exercise where you get someone to prepare what are the best arguments against this purchase. And so that you really have checked out all the alternatives. And this is true also in the world of public policy. And effective governments have similar practices. They would say, before we put this proposal to cabinet, we have, senior officials whose job it is to look at all sides of the issue, and if necessary, to make what are the best arguments against this new policy. Let's make sure that we understand them and we've really considered them before we jump into doing something. So it's not only a moral issue to make us better people, better citizens, but it actually turns out to be something that makes you a more effective manager or a more effective decision maker on things like business decisions.